There's something I want you to know before we begin. Something that nobody ever told you, but that you've been quietly waiting to hear for a very long time. You were never broken. You were never too much, too sensitive, too intense, too deep. You were never the problem that everyone around you seemed to make you feel like you were. And if you've spent years wondering why you never quite fit, why conversations felt shallow, why crowds drained you, why you notice things other people seem to walk right past, then I need you to stay with me for the next few minutes. Because what I'm about to share isn't just information, it's recognition. And for people like you, recognition is everything. Most people move through life on the surface. They talk about the weather, scroll through their phones, fill the silence with noise, and never once stop to ask themselves why they feel what they feel. But you've never been that person, have you? You've always been the one sitting slightly apart, watching, wondering, feeling things in a way you couldn't quite explain to anyone else, and slowly, painfully, starting to believe that something was wrong with you. What if I told you that nothing was ever wrong with you? What if I told you that every trait you've been ashamed of, every quality that made you feel like an outsider, is actually evidence of a psychological depth that the majority of people will live their entire lives never developing? What if feeling different wasn't your curse, but your clearest signal that you are genuinely, quietly, rare? Let's talk about what that actually means. The first quality that people like you carry, and almost never get credit for, is something psychologists call deep cognitive empathy. Not just feeling someone's emotions, but actually processing them, actually modeling their inner world inside your own mind, and living there for a moment before responding. Most people hear the word empathy and think it means being nice, being kind, tearing up at sad movies. But that's not what you do, is it? What you do is something far more complex. When someone is hurting, you don't just feel sorry for them. You feel the shape of their pain. You understand how it got there, why it makes sense, what it must be like to carry it. You sometimes understand someone else's experience more clearly than they understand it themselves. And instead of feeling powerful because of that, it often just made you feel exhausted and alone. Psychology shows that this level of empathic processing is genuinely uncommon. Research from institutions studying emotional intelligence consistently finds that most people operate on what's called affective empathy. They feel with you. But cognitive empathy, the kind where you actually think inside another person's perspective, is rarer. And it requires a kind of mental flexibility that most people simply haven't developed. The reason this hurt you is that you grew up giving people something they didn't always have the capacity to return. You understood them deeply, and they understood you barely at all. That's not a flaw in you. That is an imbalance between your depth and their range, and it is not your fault. The second quality, and this one might surprise you, is that you have an unusually sophisticated relationship with silence. Think about this. When you were younger, maybe even now, people would say things to you like, "You're so quiet," as if quiet were a diagnosis, as if silence were a symptom. The world we live in treats noise as confidence and stillness as weakness. But silence, real intentional silence, is where the most important thinking happens. And you have always known how to live there. Research in cognitive psychology suggests that people who are comfortable with silence tend to have richer internal processing lives. They are less reactive, more reflective, and significantly better at understanding nuance. While others fill every pause with words, you use the pause. You listen not just to what someone says, but to what they leave out. You read the space between the words. And that is not a social deficiency. That is a form of perception that most people never cultivate. Here is the real-life version of this that you might recognize. You're in a group conversation. Everyone is talking fast, finishing each other's sentences loudly, and you're sitting there taking it all in, noticing that two people in the group are pretending to get along, that someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes, that the energy shifted slightly when a certain topic came up. You see all of this, and nobody else seems to notice. You start to wonder if you're imagining it. You almost never are. Your relationship with silence is not shyness. It is sonar. It is a finely tuned instrument for detecting truth in a world that is drowning in performance. The third quality is one that has caused you real suffering, and I don't want to minimize that, but I do want to reframe it, because once you see it clearly, it changes everything. You have a deeply nonconformist inner compass. From very early on, you struggled to simply accept what you were told, not because you were rebellious for the sake of it, not because you wanted to be difficult, but because something inside you, something quiet and steady and impossible to silence, kept asking, why? Why do we do it this way? Why does everyone seem comfortable with something that feels so obviously wrong? Why are we pretending this is okay? Psychology research on what's called autonomous thinking, the ability to evaluate ideas independently rather than deferring to group consensus, shows it to be one of the strongest predictors of creativity, moral courage, and long-term psychological resilience. But in childhood, in classrooms, in families, in workplaces built on compliance, this quality looks like a problem. It gets labeled as difficult, as argumentative, as sensitive, as too much. You might have spent years trying to shrink this part of yourself, trying to just go along, just agree, just stop questioning everything. And it probably felt like slow suffocation, because you cannot kill the part of you that knows. You can quiet it temporarily, but it always comes back. That inner compass, it is rare. Most people outsource their sense of right and wrong to whoever is loudest in the room. You never could. And while that made your life harder, it also made you someone that the world desperately needs more of. The fourth quality is perhaps the most quietly beautiful one, and almost nobody talks about it. You process experience on a delay. What this means is that while most people move quickly from one moment to the next, feel it, react, move on, you carry your experiences differently. Something happens to you, and you don't just file it away. You turn it over. You sit with it. You return to it days, sometimes weeks later, and find new layers in it that you hadn't seen before. A conversation from 3 years ago can suddenly make complete sense to you in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. A piece of music can break something open in you that you didn't even know was closed. Psychologists who study what's called sensory processing sensitivity, a trait found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, describe this as deep processing. It's not overthinking. Overthinking is anxious and circular. Deep processing is something different. It is the mind doing what it was built to do, finding meaning, making connections, constructing a richer and more layered understanding of the world. The cost is that you carry things longer than other people do. You grieve deeper. You remember more. You can feel the emotional weight of an experience long after everyone else has moved on, and the world sees that as weakness. But here is the truth. The people who process deeply are also the people who learn the most from their lives. They are the ones who grow. They are the ones who, 20 years from now, will understand themselves and the people they love in a way that surface-level living simply cannot produce. You remember things because they matter to you. That's not a burden. That is the evidence of a life fully felt. And there is one more thing I want to leave you with, because it ties all of this together. People who feel different, really different, not in a performance way, not as a brand or an identity, but in that quiet, aching way you've known your whole life. They are often carrying what you might call a consciousness that arrived before its time. You were sensitive in environments that rewarded toughness. You were thoughtful in spaces that rewarded speed. You were honest in cultures that rewarded performance. You asked deep questions in rooms full of people who were comfortable with shallow answers. That mismatch was real. The loneliness you felt was real. The confusion was real. I'm not asking you to pretend it wasn't hard. I'm asking you to look at what that difficulty built inside you. Because every time you had to sit with something nobody else understood, you were developing a kind of interior richness that most people will spend their whole lives running from instead of building. You are not too sensitive. You are appropriately sensitive for the depth of world you are actually perceiving. You are not too much. You are fully present in a world that has learned to only show up halfway. You are not broken. You are, in the truest sense of the word, awake. And that is something worth protecting, worth honoring, worth finally, after all this time, being proud of. If this reached something real in you today, if you recognize yourself somewhere in these words, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the psychology of people who feel things fully, think differently, and carry more than anyone realizes. You belong here. And I'm glad you found your way.